Prophecy, as it appears in the biblical record, was never a detached exercise in forecasting distant centuries. It emerged from concrete historical pressure, war, exile, political collapse, and moral crisis, and was addressed to audiences who believed their present moment mattered. Modern readers often approach these texts searching for confirmation of current headlines, but the ancient writers were engaged in something more rigorous, interpreting history as it unfolded and warning communities about trajectories already visible. In the Hebrew Bible, prophecy functioned as a covenantal instrument. Prophets spoke within a shared moral framework that linked social injustice, idolatry, and political instability to inevitable consequence. Their language was elevated, poetic, and frequently symbolic, not to obscure meaning, but to compress complex realities into images that could endure transmission across generations. What appears mysterious today was often painfully concrete to its original audience. Scholars emphasize that biblical prophecy was primarily explanatory before it was anticipatory. It explained why catastrophe was coming, why empire rose and fell, and why communities fractured under pressure. When future language appears, it is usually conditional, shaped by human response, rather than fixed destiny. This distinction is essential for any responsible historical analysis. The survival of these texts through exile, redaction, and reinterpretation indicates that later communities found them disturbingly relevant. Each generation encountering instability, foreign domination, economic breakdown, cultural erosion, recognized familiar patterns in the prophetic warnings. Fulfillment, in this sense, was not a single endpoint, but a recurring recognition. This documentary begins with that premise. Not that ancient prophecies secretly encoded modern events, but that they were crafted to speak whenever societies repeat certain behaviors. Understanding how and why they continue to resonate requires careful attention to history, language, and evidence, not fear, speculation, or sensationalism. The earliest prophetic texts of the Hebrew Bible took shape within periods of extreme political vulnerability. Kingdoms were small, strategically exposed, and frequently caught between competing empires. Assyria, Babylon, and later Persia did not merely threaten military defeat. They imposed systems of tribute, forced migration, and cultural absorption. Prophetic language emerged as an interpretive response to these pressures, translating geopolitical reality into moral diagnosis. Rather than naming events as unprecedented, prophets repeatedly framed crisis as the predictable outcome of internal failure. Social stratification, exploitation of the poor, corruption of legal systems, and reliance on military alliances were treated not as political miscalculations, but as violations of covenantal order. The consequence was described in stark terms: cities emptied, land desolate, people scattered. These were not abstract warnings. Archaeological layers across the Levant confirm repeated urban destruction, population displacement, and economic collapse during precisely the periods addressed by prophetic voices. The preservation of these texts complicates any simple reading of prophecy as failed prediction. Communities that experienced defeat did not discard prophetic writings. They edited, transmitted, and reinterpreted them. This suggests that prophecy retained explanatory power even after catastrophe occurred. It helped communities understand loss, not as random misfortune, but as part of an intelligible historical pattern. Textual scholarship shows that many prophetic books were shaped over generations. Oracles addressing one crisis were reapplied to later ones, sometimes with subtle linguistic shifts. This process did not dilute authority, it reinforced it. A warning that remained relevant across centuries gained credibility precisely because history continued to follow the same contours. What modern readers often perceive as end-time language was, in its original setting, collapse-time language. Images of darkness, shaking heavens, and falling powers echoed common Near Eastern metaphors for regime change and social disintegration. Such imagery was not unique to Israelite prophecy. It appears in royal inscriptions, lamentation texts, and conquest narratives across the ancient world. The critical insight offered by historical analysis is continuity. The prophets were not isolated mystics glimpsing an unknown future. They were acute observers of their present, translating observable trajectories into theological language. When later generations claimed that these prophecies were being fulfilled again, they were not necessarily asserting supernatural foresight. They were recognizing the recurrence of conditions the texts were designed to interpret. This recurring relevance laid the groundwork for later apocalyptic developments. As crises intensified and foreign domination became prolonged rather than episodic, prophetic language expanded. The shift was not toward fantasy, but toward compression. History rendered in symbols capable of bearing repeated meaning. Understanding this transition is essential before any claim about prophecy and the present can be responsibly evaluated. As political domination became enduring rather than temporary, prophetic expression evolved into what scholars identify as apocalyptic literature. This shift did not abandon history, it reframed it. When communities lost the ability to influence events directly, symbolic language offered a way to assert meaning in circumstances that appeared chaotic and irreversible. Apocalyptic texts intensified imagery rather than specificity. Beasts, composite creatures, cosmic upheaval, and numbered eras appear not as riddles to be decoded, but as literary tools drawn from a shared ancient symbolic vocabulary. In the wider Near Eastern world, empires were often depicted as animals, chaos as darkness or flood, and regime change as cosmic disturbance. Biblical apocalyptic writers adapted these conventions to interpret domination by successive foreign powers. Historical analysis demonstrates that such texts consistently correspond to identifiable periods of crisis. Linguistic layers, loanwords, and thematic emphasis align closely with eras of Hellenistic and Roman control. Rather than projecting distant futures, these writings compress past, present, and anticipated consequence into a single symbolic frame. Time becomes elastic, not predictive. Scholars note that apocalyptic literature thrives where hope is delayed. When prophetic warnings fail to produce immediate reform or relief, the narrative horizon expands. Justice is relocated beyond the visible political order, yet still anchored in historical grievance. The expectation is not escape from history, but its moral resolution. Debate persists over whether apocalyptic texts intend literal fulfillment or rhetorical endurance. Some argue they encode precise historical sequences, others that they function as resistance literature, sustaining identity under pressure. What remains uncontested is their rootedness in lived experience. These texts did not arise in isolation. They emerged from communities acutely aware of imperial surveillance, economic extraction, and cultural erosion. The durability of apocalyptic imagery explains its repeated reuse. Later readers encountering upheaval instinctively gravitate toward symbols designed to carry weight across generations. Beasts rise again not because history repeats mechanically, but because power behaves predictably. When systems centralize, exploit, and suppress, the same metaphors regain relevance. Understanding apocalyptic prophecy as historically conditioned language rather than detached foresight reframes modern claims of fulfillment. It shifts the question from whether ancient writers foresaw contemporary events to why similar patterns continue to produce the same interpretive response. This distinction is crucial before turning to how early Jewish communities themselves applied these texts to their own present moment. Second Temple Jewish communities did not treat prophecy as a closed archive of the past. Texts were read, copied, and interpreted as living documents, capable of addressing immediate historical pressure. Manuscripts from sectarian groups reveal a conviction that prophetic words were unfolding in their own time, not because history had reached its end, but because it had entered a familiar phase of crisis. Interpretive writings from this period apply ancient oracles to contemporary rulers, priesthoods, and rival factions. The language of fulfillment appears frequently, yet it rarely implies finality. Instead, fulfillment functions as recognition, a moment when events align with patterns already described. This explains why multiple generations could sincerely believe they were witnessing prophecy realized, even when earlier expectations had passed. The Dead Sea Scrolls are particularly instructive. They preserve commentaries that reinterpret prophetic texts line by line, mapping them onto present conflicts without altering the original words. Authority remained with the ancient text, but meaning was activated through context. Prophecy, in this framework, was not rewritten, it was resituated. This approach reflects a broader ancient understanding of sacred literature. Texts were not static records, but reservoirs of meaning. Their power lay in adaptability, not precision. A prophecy that could speak only once would lose relevance quickly. One that could speak repeatedly gained enduring authority. Crucially, these communities did not imagine themselves outside history. Even when cosmic language was employed, it remained tethered to concrete realities: corrupt leadership, foreign occupation, internal division. The expectation was not an abstract end of the world, but a decisive turning point within it. By the late Second Temple period, prophetic expectation and historical frustration were tightly intertwined. The sense of living at a critical moment intensified, not because time was running out, but because conditions felt unsustainable. This psychological and social environment set the stage for later reinterpretations that would emerge within early Christianity, where prophetic language would again be claimed as fulfilled, yet in a radically redefined sense. Early Christian writings inherit this interpretive tradition rather than overturn it. Prophetic language is not abandoned, but recentered around lived experience under Roman authority, social marginalization, and delayed expectation. Claims of fulfillment are framed theologically, not as chronological closure, but as meaning discovered within ongoing historical tension. Texts composed in this period repeatedly emphasize imminence, while simultaneously preparing communities for endurance. This dual posture has often been misunderstood as contradiction. From a historical perspective, it reflects the same pattern visible in earlier Jewish interpretation. Prophecy is activated in moments of crisis, even when resolution remains deferred. Fulfillment becomes a lens through which suffering is rendered intelligible. Roman governance provides the immediate backdrop. Heavy taxation, localized violence, public executions, and rigid social hierarchies shaped daily life. Apocalyptic language describing oppressive power, judgment, and reversal aligns closely with this environment. The imagery intensifies not because writers abandoned realism, but because conventional political language was insufficient to describe the scale of dislocation being experienced. Scholars note that early Christian texts rarely identify specific dates or sequences. Instead, they emphasize vigilance, ethical transformation, and communal cohesion. The future is invoked to shape present behavior. This function mirrors earlier prophetic usage, reinforcing continuity rather than innovation. Importantly, early Christian communities did not interpret delayed fulfillment as failure. Textual adaptations reveal recalibration rather than abandonment. Expectation was reoriented from immediate political change to sustained moral and social resistance. Prophecy thus retained credibility by remaining flexible without becoming arbitrary. This period solidified a pattern that would persist for centuries. Prophetic language survived, not because predictions were narrowly fulfilled, but because history continued to generate conditions the texts were designed to address. The question, increasingly, was not whether prophecy would come true, but how often societies would recognize themselves within it. Material evidence anchors prophetic discourse firmly in historical reality. Archaeological records from the ancient Near East document repeated cycles of urban destruction, agricultural collapse, population displacement, and administrative breakdown. These conditions correspond closely with the social failures condemned in prophetic texts, lending weight to their explanatory function. Layers of burned cities, abandoned settlements, and disrupted trade routes reveal that collapse was not exceptional, but recurrent. Empires expanded rapidly, extracted resources aggressively, and fractured internally under their own weight. Prophetic warnings about pride, injustice, and overextension align with these observable patterns. The language may be symbolic, but the underlying realities were tangible. Ancient inscriptions and administrative documents further confirm the pressures faced by subject populations. Forced labor, conscription, and tribute destabilized local economies and eroded communal structures. Prophets interpreted these stresses not merely as political misfortune, but as systemic imbalance with moral consequence. Their critique intersected with lived experience. This convergence of text and evidence challenges the assumption that prophecy operates independently of history. Instead, it suggests that prophetic authority was reinforced by accuracy of diagnosis rather than precision of prediction. When communities recognized their circumstances within prophetic descriptions, credibility followed. Modern historians note that similar dynamics recur across civilizations. Centralization of power, widening inequality, ecological strain, and cultural fragmentation are not unique to antiquity. Prophetic literature persists because it addresses these recurring conditions in compressed, transferable form. The relevance of prophecy, then, is not tied to novelty, but to repetition. When societies reproduce the same structural failures, they encounter the same interpretive frameworks. Archaeology does not prove prophecy in a mystical sense. It demonstrates why prophetic language remains intelligible whenever history follows familiar trajectories. This grounding in material reality prepares the discussion for later eras, when prophecy was reactivated under new pressures. The question shifts from ancient fulfillment to enduring applicability, a pattern that becomes increasingly visible in medieval and early modern interpretation. During the medieval and early modern periods, biblical prophecy was repeatedly reactivated in response to crisis, not discovery. Plagues, famines, religious schisms, and imperial conflicts prompted renewed engagement with ancient texts that already described social unraveling and moral failure. Interpreters did not claim novelty, they claimed recognition. Manuscripts, sermons, and commentaries from these eras show a consistent pattern. Prophetic passages were mapped onto contemporary rulers, institutions, and catastrophes, with minimal alteration to the text itself. Fulfillment language reappeared, yet always provisionally. Each crisis was read as decisive, but rarely as final. The Black Death offers a clear example. Widespread mortality, labor disruption, and theological uncertainty mirrored the conditions addressed by earlier prophetic warnings. Apocalyptic imagery surged, not because society had become more superstitious, but because existing interpretive tools were already calibrated for systemic breakdown. Reformation-era Europe intensified this pattern. Competing factions accused one another of embodying prophetic condemnation, while empires framed conflict in eschatological terms. Prophecy functioned less as prediction and more as moral indictment, exposing corruption and legitimizing resistance. Scholars observe that this recurring application did not exhaust prophetic authority. On the contrary, repeated relevance reinforced it. A text that could illuminate successive crises gained status as historically reliable, even when interpretations shifted. By the early modern period, skepticism emerged alongside renewed prophetic fervor. Some thinkers began to question whether prophecy described an endpoint or an enduring condition. This tension laid the groundwork for modern historical analysis, which approaches prophecy not as coded foresight, but as a durable framework for interpreting recurring human failure under pressure. Modern scholarship approaches prophetic relevance through the lens of social psychology, historiography, and comparative literature, rather than expectation of imminent fulfillment. Researchers observe that periods of rapid change consistently reactivate ancient interpretive frameworks. Economic volatility, environmental stress, technological acceleration, and cultural fragmentation produce conditions strikingly similar to those addressed in prophetic texts. This does not imply direct correspondence, but structural analogy. Ancient prophets spoke to societies experiencing loss of control, erosion of shared values, and concentration of power beyond local accountability. Contemporary analysts note that such conditions recur whenever systems become complex enough to outpace ethical restraint. Prophetic language remains persuasive because it was forged to diagnose precisely these moments. Linguistic analysis reinforces this conclusion. Prophetic imagery is intentionally elastic, employing metaphors broad enough to absorb new contexts without losing coherence. Darkness, shaking foundations, corrupted leadership, and collective anxiety are not time-bound descriptors. They are experiential constants. Their recurrence ensures continued recognition. Importantly, modern historians resist collapsing analogy into assertion. The fact that prophetic texts resonate during crisis does not mean they predicted specific events. Rather, they articulate patterns of consequence that remain historically observable. This distinction preserves intellectual rigor while explaining enduring relevance. The persistence of prophetic engagement in modern discourse reveals less about the future than about human response to instability. When societies sense that inherited systems no longer function as promised, they seek interpretive tools that frame disruption as meaningful rather than random. Biblical prophecy offers such a framework precisely because it was shaped in comparable conditions. This perspective reframes contemporary claims that prophecy is coming true. The phenomenon is not extraordinary fulfillment, but recurring activation. The texts do not change. History supplies familiar conditions. Recognizing this dynamic is essential before evaluating competing scholarly positions on prophecy's nature and function. Scholarly debate over biblical prophecy centers on two broad interpretive models. One treats prophecy primarily as predictive revelation, oriented toward specific future outcomes. The other understands prophecy as a moral historical framework, designed to interpret recurring patterns of human behavior under pressure. Both positions draw on the same textual evidence, yet diverge sharply in methodology and expectation. Advocates of predictive models emphasize coherence across centuries, arguing that repeated relevance implies intentional foresight. They point to continuity of imagery and thematic alignment as indicators of design rather than coincidence. Critics respond that such continuity is better explained by the text's adaptive symbolism and the consistency of historical conditions that provoke crisis. Linguistic analysis strengthens the latter position. Prophetic language relies heavily on metaphor, hyperbole, and typology, devices that resist singular application. Terms associated with collapse, judgment, and restoration are rarely fixed to one event. They are reused across texts and eras. This flexibility enables reinterpretation without textual distortion. Historians also note that claims of fulfillment often emerge after events unfold, not before. Prophecy is retrospectively activated, aligning past warning with present experience. This does not render prophecy false. It clarifies its function. The text provides a framework for understanding consequence, not a script for anticipation. The unresolved tension between these models persists because prophecy occupies a liminal space between literature and belief. It resists confinement to either category. What remains consistent is that prophetic authority endures not through precise prediction, but through repeated historical intelligibility. As the discussion approaches its conclusion, the focus narrows. The question is no longer whether biblical prophecies are unfolding in the present, but why the claim continues to arise whenever societies confront familiar forms of instability. The answer lies not in decoding the future, but in understanding the past patterns that keep returning. Biblical prophecy endures because it was never confined to a single horizon of fulfillment. Its language, shaped by crisis and refined through transmission, was designed to interpret history rather than escape it. When societies fracture under inequality, overreach, and moral disintegration, the texts reassert relevance without alteration. Claims that prophecy is coming true right now emerge whenever present conditions resemble those that originally generated prophetic warning. This recurrence does not require supernatural foresight to be intelligible. It reflects the consistency of human systems and the predictability of their failure when certain thresholds are crossed. The texts speak again because history repeats its pressures, not its dates. Scholarly restraint demands clarity at this point. Prophecy does not function as a coded forecast awaiting final decryption. It operates as a diagnostic tradition, preserving memory of consequence and pattern. Its authority lies in accuracy of insight, not specificity of outcome. This explains both the persistence and the controversy surrounding prophetic interpretation. Those seeking certainty in uncertain times will continue to read ancient warnings as immediate fulfillment. Those committed to historical method will recognize a more disciplined conclusion. Biblical prophecy remains powerful because it names enduring truths about power, society, and human behavior. The warning, then, was never hidden in the future. It was embedded in history itself, preserved in texts written by observers who understood that civilizations fall in recognizable ways. The relevance of prophecy today is not evidence that the end has arrived, but that the patterns it described have not been broken.